Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Dean, for inviting me, and Felice for all of your help. All of you from the Contemporary Art Museum who have orchestrated what has turned out to be a fairly complicated Texas tour. Yes, as Dean said, I'm going to read from the first chapter of this book. The book is, maybe I should just say to begin that the book covers my first 10 years in New York. I arrived in New York in 1967. In 1977, I did an exhibition called Pictures at Artist Space. That's the event for which I'm first really known, I suppose. So this covers my juvenilia. And each chapter is based on something that I did in this period career-wise. So the first chapter, as Dean said, is about my working at the Guggenheim Museum, among other things that you'll see. And also, then, the second chapter is about a small exhibition I made of the work of Agnes Martin in 1971. The third chapter is about my stint as a reviewer at Art News, and so on. So from the first chapter, which is the Guggenheim chapter. I often tell the story of my first job in New York. I had come to the city in 1968 after graduating from college with a degree in art history. I set out one day from my Spanish Harlem apartment to go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where I planned to apply for a job. As I walked down Fifth Avenue from 98th Street near Park Avenue, I came upon the Guggenheim and thought to myself, here's a museum, I might as well try this one. I inquired of the first person I encountered in the lobby of what was then the administration wing about applying for a job. His immediate reply, to my surprise, was to ask, do you know anything about Precolumbian art? Yes, I answered. I studied it extensively in college. And so, after little further discussion, I was offered a job. Entirely fortuitously, just at that moment, the Guggenheim was getting ready to install a large exhibition of Precolumbian Peruvian art. But Thomas Messer, the Guggenheim's director at the time, had quarreled with the show's guest curator, Peruvian textile expert Alan Sawyer, and ordered him out of the museum. Whereupon some 800 art objects arrived from Lima. And no one on the Guggenheim staff, all of whom were trained as modernists, knew a Nazca pot from a moche pot. So it was thought that I might be able to help out with the installation and afterward man the visitor information desk. I subsequently managed to convince the Guggenheim administration that my field of expertise was really modern art, and so I was kept on staff, eventually as a curatorial assistant. I've told this story so many times over the years that I no longer know how much of it is simplified in the interest of narrative design and how much is embellished in the interest of amusement. I certainly remember working on the installation of the exhibition Master Craftsmen of Ancient Peru in fall 1968. More vividly, I remember the Blacktie opening, particularly the fact that some of the guests seemed to wish to compete with the exhibit. I was dazzled by socialite Doris Duke's very large ancient Peruvian necklace, and even more dazzled by seeing art collector Ethel Scull, famous for her portrait by Andy Warhol, who, evidently having no ancient Peruvian jewelry to wear, carried with her a small pillow on which rested a gold jaguar figurine. It was the wrong Precolumbian culture, but it made an impression. All the more so, her matching gold lame pantaloon jumpsuit. I remember, too, that pisco sours, cocktails made with a Peruvian brandy, were served at the opening. Also, the Guggenheim in those days always served giant boiled shrimp as hors d'oeuvres at their gala openings. A year or so into my brief tenure at the museum, a group of us tried unsuccessfully to organize the staff to join a labor union. One of our arguments was that the budget for these private parties was way out of proportion to the budget for the pitifully low staff salaries. Still, I was pleased to say that I worked at the Guggenheim. It was a famous museum, one of the most famous, because it had a famous building, also one of the most famous. And that made my job seem glamorous. My memory of how glamorous it felt was rekindled in 1999 when I saw in the Museum of Modern Art's exhibition catalog, The Museum as Muse, a photograph by Gary Winogrand of the Guggenheim's 10th anniversary party in 1970. You'll have to take it on faith that the blurred fingers on the left edge of Winogrand's picture are mine. I was dancing with a woman in white, whose name is Nicole, and whose port-de-bras confirms what I remember best about her, that she came to New York from the south of France to study with Martha Graham. After all of these years, I still enjoy telling people the story about my first job in New York, working at the Guggenheim Museum. But the story isn't true. That is, it isn't true that my first job in New York was working at the Guggenheim. I have another story of my first job in New York, but I tell it more selectively because it entails a different sort of glamour. I had left college before to come to New York in 1967, before finishing my degree. In what should have been my final semester at Tulane University, I was too worried about being drafted into the military during the Vietnam War to concentrate on my schoolwork. Or rather, what preoccupied me was the way that I would escape the draft. In order to be classified 4F, unfit to serve, I told the Army at my induction physical that I was gay. That was not so easy in those days. Homosexual acts were still illegal in most of the 50 states, and known homosexuals were barred from civil service jobs of any kind, even working in a post office. Nevertheless, during the war, young men were so desperate to escape the draft that many claimed to be gay, whether or not it was true. Consequently, the military required proof in the form of an official letter from a psychiatrist. I thus had to disclose my sexuality not only to the military doctors, but also to the university psychiatric counselor. Anxiety spoiled what should have been my final semester at Tulane. So I quit school and moved to New York, where I got my first job. In summer 1967, Charles James hired me to help him organize his papers for the purpose of writing his memoir. At the time, James was nearly destitute and living in a squalid suite of small rooms at the Chelsea Hotel. My job with him didn't last long at all. In fact, only a couple of weeks. I resented having to do menial tasks like walking his beagle around Chelsea. I wasn't happy that he was slipping amphetamines into my morning coffee. I couldn't tolerate his tantrums. The last straw was his telling me that instead of paying me for my work, he would open a charge account for me at Barney's. All told, I just wasn't ready for Charles James. Even so, being able to say that my first job in New York was working for him is a story that I tell shamelessly in some circles, where it has even greater cachet than saying that my first job in New York was working at the Guggenheim Museum. But who is Charles James? He is a cult figure in the fashion world, where he is regarded as America's greatest, perhaps only, couturier. He was the subject of the Metropolitan Museum's annual Summer Costume Institute exhibition in 2014. James's career spanned the 30s, 40s, and 50s. He was the dressmaker of choice to many well-known society women of his era, Babe Paley, Millicent Rogers, Lee Radziwill. For other fashion designers, Coco Chanel, Elsa Schiaparelli. For opera divas, Lily Pons and Risa Stevens. ballerinas Alicia Markova and Tamara Karsavina, and movie stars Gloria Swanson, Marlene Dietrich, Jennifer Jones, and even Janet Gaynor, who hardly needed a dress designer since she was married to Adrian. James was highly regarded in the art world, which was unusual for a fashion designer. He received praise from Museum of Modern Art director Alfred Barr, and his work was the subject of a solo exhibition at the Brooklyn Museum while he was in his early 40s. Indeed, James not only made artist Lee Krasner and art patron Dominique Dumenil were clients. Indeed, James not only made clothes for Mrs. Dumenil, but also decorated the interior of her modernist house in Houston, designed by Philip Johnson in his early Musean phase in 1948. James's art world connections explain my getting a job with him. Another of his clients was my friend Johann Bultmann's mother, Jean Bultmann, who knew that James needed an assistant and recommended me. These people venerated James, both as a fashion designer, as an artist, a sculptor in cloth. At the beginning of his career, he billed himself as a sartorial structural architect. He was famous for draping fabric directly on his clients' bodies in the initial process of constructing their clothes. Richard Martin, the late curator of the Metropolitan Museum's Costume Institute, described James's dresses as monumental sculptures in fabric. A James dress, he wrote, could very nearly stand on its own, so filled was it with material, but the picturesque effect was that of a dream walking. Bombastic would be an accurate adjective for many of James's gowns. The original meaning of its noun form, bombast, is padding for clothes. In spite of the discrepancy between the work's bulky structure and gossamer appearance, James was considered by some to be a true modernist. The following recollection of one of James's clients reads to me as a wonderful parody of the idea of modernist autonomy in its description of the subject-object relation between the dress and its owner. And I quote, "He was sometimes so entranced by the shape he was sculpting over one's own shape that when the dress arrived, finished, it was impossible to get into. It existed on its own. Much time was then spent in discerning the proper relationship between shapes." I like to picture the scene of the lady in her dressing room. Unable to get herself into her new gown, she simply positions it somewhere near her and contemplates it as the self-reflexive work of art that it surely must be. In the face of such transcendent presentness, who's to complain? I'm obviously referring to Michael Fried's notion of autonomy here. Compare this account with that of Anne, Countess of Ross, another James client. But the wearer, if she wanted to enjoy his creations, had sometimes to be sacrificed to his designs. To begin with, there could be the mystery of how to get into the clothes when they arrived, or which was the front or the back, which he might have altered at the last minute. With some, walking might be difficult, or sitting down tricky, but an appreciative wearer would gladly cooperate. That modern forms do not necessarily follow function was one of the lessons of the museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology's 2004 exhibition, Form Follows Fashion, which featured James as presiding genius. James received the Coty American Fashion Critics Award in 1950, lauded not for the mystery of how or whether a dress was to be worn, but for, quote, the great mystery of color and artistry of draping. I'll stop there in this chapter. I then return actually to the other subject of the chapter, which is the removal of Daniel Buren's painting sculpture, the banner that hung in the museum's rotunda that was famously removed from the Guggenheim International in 1971. It was actually kind of transition moment is that in a letter to Studio International, Dan Flavin referred to the Buren work as that French drapery. So I'm going to read one other short passage, and this is from the final chapter, which is called Pictures Before and After. It's about the making of the pictures exhibition and its reception. And I'm reading this because I want to give you an indication of something else that I do in this book beyond the kind of anecdotes and research that are reflected in what I've just read, which is to actually perform the work of a critic, which I am. So the book is a hybrid between anecdote, cultural history research, and actual criticism. So it is about one of the films by Jack Goldstein, which was in the Pictures exhibition in '77. Although extremely brief and simple, a ballet shoe is often inaccurately described. For example, I wrote in the revised Pictures essay, that is an essay that I wrote for the journal October based on the catalog essay that I had written for the Pictures exhibition. I wrote in the revised Pictures essay, quote, "A pair of hands comes in from either side of the film frame and unties the ribbon of the shoe. The dancer moves off point. The entire film lasts 22 seconds. In fact, the hands do not come into the frame. They are already there when the film begins. Let me have another go at it. A ballet shoe shows a ballet dancer's foot from just above the ankle, standing on point on a hardwood floor. The ribbons of her point shoe are tied in a bow, and their ends are held by the thumbs and index fingers of a pair of hands. Those hands slowly pull sideways until the bow is untied, whereupon they drop the ribbons and disappear from the frame on either side. The ribbons dangle to the floor, and the dancer slowly descends from point. When her heel touches the floor, her ankle relaxes and pulls slightly upward, and the film comes to an end. Including the brief title at the beginning, the film lasts 40 seconds. A ballet shoe scenario, if we can call it that, is odd. Ballet dancers don't tie their point shoe ribbons in a knot. Sorry, they tie their point shoe ribbons in a knot, not a bow. A bow wouldn't be secure enough. And they tuck the ends inside the ribbon that wraps around the ankle to hide them. So one would not see a bow on a dancer's shoe when she stands on point. Goldstein imagined this. In the October version of Pictures, I wrote of the film's fragmented images, by which I meant the disembodied foot and hands, as well as the unexplained untying action, as, quote, generating multiple psychological and tropological resonances. But I didn't say what those resonances are. I surely had fetishism in mind, and I might have felt that the untying suggests disrobing, perhaps even despoiling. Temporality is key. However short a ballet shoe is, and however truncated its event, however much it converts event into image, it requires time. It is a picture that occurs over time. This is obviously the case regarding the hands untying the ribbon, but it is also important for what follows the untying, the descent from point. Most descriptions of a ballet shoe describe this moment in such a way as to suggest the dancer could not stay on point once the ribbon was untied. Thus, the scholar David James, and I quote, "The foot of a dancer on point occupies the frame until a man's hands untie the shoe's ribbons, releasing the tension and causing the dancer's foot to sink to the floor." It is not the ribbon that maintains the tension in the dancer's foot, nor does her foot sink to the floor. I repeat, the dancer slowly descends from point. Among the tropological resonances that I read from the film now is that a dancer on point is a metaphor for ballet, or more accurately, romantic ballet. In 1832, when Marie Taglioni performed in La Sylphide, it was the first time anyone danced on point, and ballet was irrevocably changed. It marked the moment that ballet became, as George Balanchine famously said, woman. Until Taglioni went up on point, virtuoso dancing was something men did. It was considered undignified for women, and they didn't wear shoes that would even make it possible. But if the dancer on point is now ballet, and moreover, ballet as woman, the dancer descending from point is dancing. It is a meaningful dance step. Taking it as such, we might read the untying gesture of a ballet shoe differently, as a symbol of the male dancer giving and then releasing his support to the ballerina. Although she makes use of his support, she does not require it. When he lets go of her, she continues to dance. In Goldstein's film, the descent from point takes 8 seconds. That might seem like almost nothing, but in ballet, it is everything. Watching ballet, you must attune your eyes to what occurs in a very short space of time in order, for example, to see the dancer's line at the climax of a jeté, or to distinguish whether the dancer is dancing slightly in advance of the music or simply following it. Those 8 seconds in a ballet shoe require considerable strength and control on the part of the dancer, and it really matters whether she simply moves off point or slowly and smoothly descends from point. I doubt that Goldstein knew the difference, but the dancer did. I didn't know it when I first wrote about a ballet shoe, but I do now. So that's what I'll read, and I'll be joined by